A person isn't measured by where they started or even by where they ended, it's by how far they walked on their path, which is why we aspire to follow in the footsteps of legends. So let's talk about Wano and its misleading legends, because as crazy as it sounds, Wano is not a land of swordsmen. I'll explain that, and by the end of this video you'll see why Oda revealed Zoro's family tree in volume 105's SPS, and how that might have fully exposed the secret that's been hiding in the shadows of One Piece that connects Zunisha to Shusui and, most importantly, the last saga. The way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. As I was saying, Wano has been regarded as this land of samurai that would end up becoming the source of not just Zoro's importance, but also where his future power boost should have come from, and ultimately the place where we expected the backstory of one of our favorite characters. But the problem is that Wano was the Wano of the past. After learning about Wano, we should have quickly realized that this wouldn't be the prime location to develop Zoro unless we wanted him to do it alone. Yes, Wano is known for swords and swordsmen, but let's talk about why. Wano was originally known as the country of gold. The resources of Wano was sought after by the world after the Void Century, and the legendary samurai Ryuma led the country in defending it. Because of Ryuma and the legend of him slaying a dragon, Wano then became known for its samurai and was remembered for it. Ryuma was laid to rest, and his sword, the Shusui, was declared a national treasure, forever remembered as the god of the blade or sword god Ryuma. But how long ago was this? Wasn't this at a minimum hundreds of years ago? Thereafter, no other legends came from Wano or left their names in history even from within Wano. But then let's look at what happens 20 years ago. The greatest swordsman of that time was killed and his potential was smothered. Kaido took reign over Wano and systemically crippled them over the next 2 decades. Orochi and Kaido took the weapons and banned martial arts to suppress a potential uprising. So does it make sense to still call Wano the land of samurai when the strongest warriors perished and most of the able-bodied samurai are severely stunted in their potential? So just like the legends of Wano being the country of gold is no longer true, the legends of the samurai are also a story of the past. And after realizing all of this, does it make sense to think that Zoro, the man who we believe will become the world's strongest swordsman, will gain anything from illusions of the past? The truth is, Oda actually showed us from the very beginning of the story where Zoro's character arc will develop, and I'm here to connect those dots and break Oda's vault of secrets. While we're on the topic of security, we should make sure you're having the best security as well. This video is sponsored by Atlas VPN, one of the best VPNs made for regular people like you and me. If you don't believe me, security.org says that Atlas VPN is the best at data breach monitoring, which is arguably one of the most important services you can get. And right now, you can get Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.83 per month plus 3 months extra with a 30-day money-back guarantee. This is a limited time offer, so make sure you get the deal by clicking my link in the video description below. I myself use this VPN, especially in the light of the recent YouTube hacking spree that several of my peers have become a victim of. So protect yourself on the internet like I do. This is the first line of protection that you can have against advertisers, internet service providers, hackers, and even the government. There was a time when I trusted myself to navigate all of the scams and phishing emails, but they are becoming extremely difficult to avoid, making the future of the internet a really scary place. But it doesn't have to be. The fear of accidentally making one mistake and risking your entire livelihood, including your bank account, social security, and so much more, can be wiped away with this addition to your life. While it primarily is for stopping ads and malware, you can also unlock your favorite content from all over the world, keep your browser searches private, save money while shopping, and with Atlas VPN you can protect unlimited devices with a single subscription. You never know who is watching, and Atlas VPN wants to give you some peace of mind, so make sure to click the link in the description with code ParVision and grab your limited time special 3-year deal for $1.83 per month with an extra 3 months added. At this ridiculously low price, you'll be able to take the proactive measure to protect your privacy and well-being with Atlas VPN. So let's start at the most obvious place, Zoro's goal. Dracul Mihawk. Yes, we are using government names here today, and the reason why is Oda plays with our focus. We tend to focus on the Mihawk part, which we will talk about, but Dracul, the etymology of which is ultimately derived from the Latin Draco, which means dragon. So if we were to re-say his name, it would be Dragon Mihawk. Arguably one of the funnier names in fiction if you have an immature mind, but we here are the epitome of maturity, so let's focus. So obviously we don't need to break down Mihawk, which simply is tied to his epithet and his corresponding eyes, hawk eyes. One thing of note though is, what is Mihawk's last name? Is it Dracul or is it Mihawk? I feel that it could be an interesting piece of information, but anyways, when we take a look at Mihawk, we see sharp sword-like facial hair. He primarily wears this red and black clothing that makes him resemble a Spanish swordsman. Then he has floral patterns throughout his design that adds to the Spanish aesthetics. Then we sometimes catch Mihawk thirst trapping in his open collared shirt that gives him a European style. His sword, the Yoru, resembles a Messier, which is German for knife. It's just oversized because I guess it's cooler. But on his chest and throughout his design, there is this cross that also originates primarily from Europe. What's actually funny is that before the crucifix shape was primarily tied to religion, it was mainly viewed as a farmer's cross to protect crops. And then we see Mihawk relegated to his calm life as a farmer with a bunch of baboons. But let's focus. We can easily see there's a theme behind Mihawk that isn't really rooted in one country of origin, but he is an amalgamation of a bunch of European countries. So the world's strongest swordsman is not Japanese at all, but instead European. And as we covered before, during Mihawk's time, the land of Wano was intrinsically not a country of swordsmen because of Kaido, to the point that if Mihawk did come to Wano, they would have probably regarded him as an instant god due to his skill. The only swordsmen in Wano competent enough to understand his power were from an era prior to Kaido, and survived through various secretive means and are not representative of the country, to the point that the fact that they are regarded as the strongest warriors on Wano should tell you how behind the country is at large. All of the previous daimyos were slaughtered and uprooted, and any notable swordsmen were more focused on survival rather than their swordsmanship. So with that in mind, let's take a look outside of Wano with what we see of swordsmen. We can sort of dismiss the Marines at the moment, but something that's notable is that many of the ranked vice admirals use katanas, but in general Marines seem to just use whatever weapon is available or is preferred. But if we are talking about prominent swordsmen, there is the man who countered Mihawk and was regarded in Viver cards to be on a level near Mihawk. Vista, another swordsman who brandishes a very European style and wields sabers which are European, and outside of Vista there's not that many super notable swordsmen, but I'm gonna highlight a few more strong representatives of swordsmanship. Like, let's talk about Cavendish, who has a similar plume to Mihawk's hat. Cavendish hails from Bourgeoisie Kingdom, which is clearly related to France given the name. Cavendish is noted to be a genius of the sword and extremely skilled, as he demonstrated in Dressrosa, and even deflected an attack from Doflamingo. Cavendish, by the way, when he is in his Hakuba form, becomes a nearly unstoppable gentle blade user, which is a style of swordsmanship that Oda differentiates from power style that Zoro and Odin seem to use, whereas Mihawk apparently found the perfect medium, as Zoro stated in the introduction. And before we move on, let's highlight a swordsman close to home, in Brook. Our skeleton Straw Hat is another extremely notable swordsman who hails from an unnamed certain kingdom, where he was the leader of a battle convoy that resulted in him learning fencing, but more importantly, most of his moveset has a French naming scheme, which may be important at a later time. And let's not forget Trafalgar D. Waterloo, with countless French references in his name. He hails from Flevens, which is a reference to Italy, and he's also a masterful swordsman who can wield a cursed blade. Also Mont Blanc Noland, whose family name is French for White Mountain, and was another prominent swordsman. So it seems like the greatest swordsman in the current verse seems to all stem from European swordsmanship, which kind of makes sense given the last saga, and Celestial Dragons are all giving heavy Latin themes from Doflamingo to Saint J. Garcia Saturn, which all of this does make sense, right? That if the Vatican Roman themed world government were the victors of the Void Century, then as we know, the victors not only decide history, but they also pave the future. In that time, Wano was crippled from multiple points of view in that they were isolated, restricting travel in and out, whereas the world around them were able to trade and compete, honing a swordsmanship style that develops separately and becomes exemplified by the European blended swordmaster Mihawk. But that history is not as separate as we may think. There's 3 primary points of context that I want to discuss because it will probably lead us to the real resolution of Zoro's dreams of becoming the best. So the first is the Minks. The Minks live in Mokumo Dukedom, emphasis on duke, which is a term that originates from French word duke and Latin word dux, referring to a leader, a term used in Republican Rome. Interestingly though, the architecture might fool you for some European civilizations, but it's actually based off of Yemen, which is interesting for a whole other reason which I'll get to in a separate video. But what I want to focus on is the fighters. See, there was a split in the dukedom that we entered into between Inuarashi, the ruler of the day, and Nekomamushi, the ruler of the night. Nekomamushi has the guardians whose counterparts during the day were the musketeers, and the musketeers were primarily all swordsmen. Musketeers again being derived from a French word that was essentially referring to a type of soldier with a musket. And while that's ironic for the story of One Piece in that these fighters primarily use swords, it's not like the actual musketeers were swordless. What's interesting is that the musketeers was actually a junior unit in France that was a part of the royal household or the kings of France's house. While not royalty themselves, it was either an entryway or a foothold into nobility. That being said, why are the Minks wearing musketeer outfits? Why do they have French weaponry and even French naming schemes for their societal structure? Isn't that incredibly interesting considering the Minks have been isolated for most of history? That would mean that they have maintained this tradition and structure for their entire existence. I don't think it's a secret or even revolutionary to say that Zou might be the key to solving nearly everything in One Piece because of how interestingly connected it is. So the first thing that stands out is the hierarchy that seems to exist here. See, the Minks, while they have called Carrot the new king, the naming scheme they have is Duke and probably Duchess for their leader. That's the highest rank below an emperor or a king or even a grand duke. And then to add to that, musketeers guard for the lower nobility, which all of this implies that there was a larger empire that Mokomo dukedom was a part of. And right now, the obvious answer, even though it's counterintuitive, is the world government. Again, it makes sense if you look at the Roman Latin connections we are getting from the world government and Vatican Holy See sovereignty being created, but it doesn't make sense because the Minks were known to be brothers of the Kozuki, which is Wano, the nation that isolated from the rest of the world during the Void Century. How are the Minks thematically tied to both? Maybe it's just an outlier. But that actually brings me to our second point of contact between Wano and the European empires. The second point of contact is actually Ryuma. Yes, sword god Shimotsuki Ryuma is Wano's connection to the European swordsmanship, but more specifically, his sword, the Shusui. The kanji breaks down to autumn water, which ties it to the Shimotsuki even more because of the autumn connection in the name. But here's the thing, the Shusui might not even be made in Wano, or could be made by someone outside of Wano. The reason I say that is because of this pattern Oda created. Recently, we had gotten the reveal of Kozuburo, and interestingly, in an SBS way ahead of time, Oda personified Zoro's swords, which at the time was Wado Ichimonji, Sandai Ketetsu, and Shusui. Wado Ichimonji looked exactly like young Kozuburo, which makes sense because he forged that sword. That to me implies that he put his own image into the sword. I say that carefully because interestingly, Hitetsu forged the Sandai Ketetsu, but it does not look like Hitetsu, but instead resembles the silhouette from the Amatsuki Daimya, which we discussed in the Amatsuki Civil War video. But the overall point being is that these personifications are meaningful in some way, especially this one where Oda went out of his way to answer and start a precedent that saw reflection in the manga. The fact that Wado was forged by Kozuburo and his image was given to us nearly 100 chapters before it was revealed in the story makes these personifications all that more important. So all of that bringing us to Shusui. Why does the Shusui look like this? I'm not trying to profile this man, but this person does not look like they are from Wano. The style of it is too different. The mustache and hair alone feel so odd. Keep in mind, this is the national treasure of Wano, and Oda decided to personify it as what looks like to me as a European man. And just reiterating for emphasis, the legendary hero of Wano, sword god Ryuma, is wielding a sword personified as a European person. This is a detail we should not overlook. And you might be thinking, that's a stretch. This guy could be from Wano. But that's the fun part. We actually get a really fun doppelganger for the Shusui in the Whitebeard Pirates. Thunder Lord Migai is another prominent swordsman for a completely separate reason on this channel, and is essentially a similar design that Oda chose for Shusui's personification. Migai, which, pardon my assumption, could tie this character to Irish or Scottish origins, as that's a naming scheme in those regions, but at the minimum it is European. And even without all of that, his outfit is not different from the European styles that we talked about before. To me, this was an incredibly interesting choice. Just to reiterate, Ryuma's sword that was forged black and bestowed to Zoro with an instant recognition of quality was personified by Oda as this. Now, that leads me to a few directions. Either the masterful blacksmith that made Shusui was European, or it was made in the image of this person. Both directions are curious. The national treasure of the isolated Wano ended up revering something with ties outside of Wano, which could make sense since Ryuma's history was that he had to defend Wano against the world. So this is now two instances of interesting European connections with Wano, their most treasured relationship with the Minks, and their national treasure, both showing an interesting story that might come together when we look at Zoro's family lineage provided to us in Volume 105's SBS. So at first glance, it feels that Zoro's family lineage connecting him to Ryuma, which was never explicitly created within the manga, has been spoiled. But the way I see it, and I believe most should have seen it as, is that this was an obvious connection. A connection so obvious that devoting time to it wouldn't have provided any actual meaningful progression in the story. It would have simply been eye candy for us viewers. Let's remember that even if Zoro visited Ryuma's grave, his grave was emptied by Moria. And the main thing there now is Shusui, which Zoro already was familiar with as he had it since Thriller Bark. And on top of that, again, there were no swordsmen there on Wano that could have boosted Zoro's strength beyond what Mihawk had already taught him. And all that could have been stated was Zoro was related to the late great Yasue and Daimyo of Ringo, and all of which would have resulted in maybe a sentimental pause for Zoro. But other than that, Zoro would probably not really care for loose familial connections. So then why am I even bringing up the SBS? It's because just like us focusing on the hidden European connection that Wano has, we should do the same with Zoro's family tree. The place that I focused on was that we found out that Zoro's father and paternal grandfather was where the Roronoa name came from. While assumed to many, this is the brand new information that triggered my observation haki. See, we already know the origin of Zoro's family name. Oda gave it to us in Volume 4's SBS. It was that Roronoa was based off of, and pardon my pronunciation, Francois Lolonoe, an extremely violent and cruel French pirate. And just for a taste of how cruel, he cut open a man, pulled out their heart, and bit it like a wolf to intimidate a force of Spanish soldiers, and was the kind of man who could win even when vastly outnumbered, which the brutality is something we could expect out of Zoro. I mean, I've highlighted it before, but Zoro told King that he would rip out his throat with his bare teeth if he needed to. So this was a significant connection and an inspiration for Oda, and what I'm proposing after highlighting the European swordsman in this video is that Zoro comes from a hidden lineage of swordsmen that were prominent on the European side of the One Piece world. When you think about it, this entire video, underneath everything that should have stuck with you, is that Wano was isolated for what seems like to be a majority of history. There's not many opportunities for commingling, and so Zoro might be the first or most recent child of both Wano, the previous land of samurai, and One Piece's European empire that claims the current top spot for swordsmanship, and in Zoro's case specifically French heritage. And you might be confused. This part of the connections might be the weakest one for many of you, but the Shusui's design kind of looks like a caricature of Francois Lolonois, doesn't it? Similar dinky mustache and same shoulder cut hair and the same kind of weird bangs. While I don't know why Oda gave him the crimson chin, the prominent features can be connected to Pin Zoro, Zoro's grandfather, which would imply that Zoro's paternal ancestors might be connected to Shusui on both sides. It might even be that, like Mihawk had a rival and is seeking Zoro to be his rival for the world's greatest swordsman title, that Ryuma also had a contemporary. His contemporary might have been Roronoa Francois, just a placeholder name other than the Roronoa aspect. And you're probably thinking I pulled that option out of my booty, but you know what's funny? The first Frenchman recorded to ever set foot in Japan was actually Francois Caron. Is this name connection a coincidence? That could be the lore behind Shusui. He was the first man to step on Wano despite Ryuma defending it, creating admiration and respect and possibly resulting in a black blade after the battle. By a twist of fate, the original rivals or contemporaries Ryuma and Shusui connect their lineage on Zoro. So yes, I am saying that the Shusui is based off of a Frenchman from this tiny sketch and that Zoro's Roronoa lineage is French. And I'm also saying that the village that the Shimotsuki happened to find in the vast oceans that they traversed after becoming criminals and pirates was probably related to the Shusui, which would actually make more sense if the Shimotsuki had some kind of knowledge of this island prior to landing here, rather than just landing somewhere completely new and saving the village without any reason. But rather they were saving them as a debt to the origin of the Shusui. And all of that implies that this island that the Shimotsuki village was founded on was actually a French-based island, which isn't crazy because many times, especially in One Piece, there are islands that are beneath kingdoms that are in the near vicinity. So let's take a look at that. The first one to pocket for a later video is Okyo Kingdom, where Nami originally came from, and in my opinion definitely connects back to Wano because it's Tokyo backwards. And then there's Luffy's kingdom, Goa Kingdom, which has been tied back to a state in India that was under Portugal's colonial possession, which would make sense given Luffy's real world Brazilian representation that Oda has stated. But anyways, this last one is where it gets interesting. There's one more kingdom in the Blue Sea, and that is Frausch Kingdom. We have not seen this kingdom, but we have seen its queen. And Frausch is Middle English for France. And again, this is the only other noted kingdom within the East Blue. So it's not crazy to think that Zoro's island pre-Shimotsuki occupation was primarily French, meaning Roronoa Pin Zoro had heritage relating to them. It could be that this island was a microcosm of the relationship that existed in the past through the Minks connecting to Wano, but also Ryuma's sword. And on top of that, Frausch Kingdom is a part of the world government, and this could be one of the original 20 kingdoms. We have no context to say otherwise. This kingdom could have been massively widespread and had colonies all over. And why is that important? Well, if we look at colonies that would be underneath a French kingdom, wouldn't it be the dukes and duchesses, like Mokomo Dukedom? Wouldn't that explain why they have the musketeers and the outfits? Keep in mind, this connection would have been well in the past. The Mokomo Dukedom has been isolated since the Void Century. That means that they are a time capsule, implying a French thematic existed, and it would make sense if the Frausch Kingdom was the originator of that inspiration. So before I go on, I want to consolidate really quickly and then expand to something really crazy. So Zoro's father ties him to Ryuma and possibly even Shusui. This would make Arashi and Zoro the culminative connection of two of the best bloodlines for swordsmanship. But let's take a look at something a little more stretchy, the silhouettes. A lot of people have seen an interesting connection of Zoro's father specifically to Mihawk. The hair could look very similar. Honestly, like considering Mihawk was introduced in the chapter called Storm, which is English for Arashi, Mihawk could be Zoro's deadbeat dad that got lost and forgot about him. But jokes aside, we also highlighted how the grandfather has got that crimson chin going on. That chin emphasis could be the Shusui connection, for example. But with these reveals, many have went the direction that Mihawk probably clashed with Zoro's father, which is very interesting. Then my favorite connection is that Zoro's grandfather's name is a pun on Snake Eyes, and that's an obvious connection to Mihawk, as his epithet is Hawkeyes, which relates to his name. So it would be crazy if Zoro's grandfather was known as Snake Eyes. I almost wonder if all these European swordsmen with considerable lineage have an animal connection in their name. I mean, there wasn't any main ones to go off of besides Cavendish, whose name refers to bananas, so no. But then you remember Hakuba. Because of Hakuba, Cavendish gained the epithet as the sickle weasel. Now we got 3 possible connections, and so I wonder if there was some animal connection to European swordsmanship that could serve as the source of all of them. Oh wait, no. There's no way, right? The Minks? Could it possibly be that the Mokomo Dukedom connects all of these people's origins? These animal names could allude to Mink ancestry. But then again, there's so many characters with animal-inspired names. But on the other side, I mean, it's kind of fair though. It's not the names necessarily that we're focusing on, with Mihawk and Cavendish, hawk-like eyes and weasel-like movements. It's their epithets that denote their behavior, which is the important part. But then, let's really think about it. Don't the minks regard humans as lesser minks? Just monkey minks with less fur, which really fits the idea that the minks were the origin for these humans. And again, wouldn't it be weird that there aren't hybrid minks, since we know fishman-human hybrids exist and can look as normal as Chimney or even Dellinger? While the minks were more isolated as a nation, we do know of several notable minks that left the dukedom, so I would imagine that mink humans do exist, and that would explain so many fringe examples in One Piece. Like Merry, the man who made the Going Merry. This would literally be an example of a lesser fur mink. What if the lineage became even more diluted? I wonder how much of it would remain. Cavendish getting possessed, being named a weasel, and going out of control does sound a lot like Sulong form, doesn't it? Though birds aren't minks, Mihawk's eyes also could connect back to the Sulong form. And if Eam, for example, was in permanent Sulong, that could make a lot of sense. I mean, what's interesting is if Thunderlord McGuy was a descendant of minks, that could explain how he got his epithet and why he can use what resembles to be Electro. But even for Zoro, how many times does he get referred to as a wild beast? I mean, even he himself called himself that. If mink lineage was within Zoro, then wouldn't it make sense as to why he was tolerating the mink medicine so well, and why afterwards he said something so uncharacteristic in that he told King, "Who knows, by the end of this, I might be tearing your throat out with my teeth. Anything to ensure I win this fight," which I've never heard Zoro say anything like this before, and coincidentally, it was right after he took that mink medicine. Also, wouldn't this soft lineage connection parallel a similar lineage connection that we got for Sanji with the Lunarians in the same time frame? It could even be that just like Sanji has to fight his genetics for emotional control, Zoro could progressively become more mink-like as he takes the medicine, giving both of Luffy's strongest fighters an innate connection to the ancient races of One Piece. And here's the craziest part in my opinion. The thing with mink lineage is it works the same as fishman lineage, in that within that lineage you essentially contain the entire family history of animals, and the child can be born as any of those animals within that lineage. And if you keep that in mind, then that explains why Zoro's entire moveset is animal based. He ends up resembling those animals incredibly well, to the point where for moves like Ichi Gorilla, he gains gorilla arms like through some weird semi-Kikon. That could be him tapping into that lineage factor. And I do have an alternative theory that I made a long time ago that is even crazier, but connects a similar set of dots. But so again, to reiterate the two main thoughts and why they are important. Volume 105's SBS showing Zoro's backstory to me indicates that we have been focusing on Zoro's obvious Wano lineage. And while important, that might not be what's really important for the future of Zoro. In that SBS, Oda clarified that Zoro himself is not aware of this family history. And Oda even says, well, that's as far as I'll say. Which again is what he said in the previous Shimotsuki SBS lore dumps, which was followed by it being brought into the manga several chapters later. And like we said before, what would Zoro actually gain from Wano? Considering Wano was essentially stripped of its prominent swordsman, Zoro already met Ryuma's corpse and even used his sword. Which another point to make is that yes, Ryuma approved of Zoro, but that doesn't necessarily mean the sword has to. We found out recently that each sword has its own will. So the national treasure of Wano, one of two black blades in the entire series, and sword god Ryuma's weapon surely would have a will that is not agreeable, but adapted well to Zoro. If his Roranoa lineage connected the two together, that would explain why there was no issue in Zoro wielding the sword. But also, when you think of what Zoro emphasized at the end of his fight with King, it was that Oden wielded Enma as if it were light as a feather. I can't help but think that might be alluding to gentle blade style that apparently Mihawk has a perfect balance of. Zoro clearly is very strong, and there's not many strength feats left for him to prove himself on, but gentle blade could be what Zoro needs to learn, and so far most of the European swordsmen, if not all the prominent ones, were experts in this. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the early phases of the last saga we go to a European country that ends up fleshing out this very mysterious lineage left for Zoro, a French themed land that brings to the forefront some missing history regarding Zoro. Honestly, a shot in the dark is that this land could could be in the West Blue, as weird as that sounds. That'd be where Brook's unnamed kingdom is, which we noted to be French themed. On top of that, Shanks is supposed to be from the West Blue, Ohara and Elysia Kingdom, but also Kano country, which Zoro also specifically noted them for their interesting power feats. And for reference, I noted Elysia Kingdom because that is where King Caesar is, which if you know Roman history, that's an important name. And so if the last saga is centered around Merijois, which by the way also has French-inspired naming, where the capital represents the Vatican in its saint system and symbolism that we see in the Empty Throne, then Elysia might be very important. And as a reminder, this kingdom was first mentioned to us through King Thalassa, who warned us of Dragon in a flashback during Drum Kingdom. So in terms of narrative importance and planning, this kingdom has been inserted into the journey very early on. My overall point for this video was to be like Blackbeard and don't sleep on the hidden mystery Oda has implanted with Zoro's backstory. We often have been getting development for our main characters in the weirdest places. I don't think anyone expected Whole Cake Island and Big Mom's arc would be where we get the immense lore dump on Sanji. Sure, the food aesthetic should have been signaling the importance for Sanji, but we randomly got the Germa backstory here, which elevated Sanji's potential immensely, and we are still feeling the effects of that hundreds of chapters later. I personally never thought that Dressrosa would have been the arc that Usopp gained observation haki and became a god. We all assumed it would be Elbaf, and it still might be, but you can't discount the Noland, Haki, and Tontada developments that were randomly tied in here for Usopp. Now that we are in the last saga, we are going to be surprised the entire way through. The same surprise that I had as a kid when Zoro put that sword in his mouth and proclaimed that he would become the greatest swordsman in the world, followed by us meeting that swordsman only a year into the story, the Spanish themed swordsman that most likely connects to all of the Spanish thematically named celestial dragons, his name even referencing a dragon for when Zoro beats him, and that could even be the narrative parallel to Ryuma slaying a dragon. These were all parts of Oda's original plans, and now we are just starting to get Shanks' information. In that regard, I think both Luffy and Zoro and their respective goals, Shanks and Mihawk, have been saved for last. I mean, why wouldn't you save the best for last? Now that Oda has doubled down on that French connection for Zoro, I have almost no doubt that Zoro's story will be elevated while we flesh out the Roman Empire history that the last saga will contain. I mean, the famous 100-Year War involves France, and so many vital parts of One Piece also involve French connections. For example, Trafalgar D. Waterloo, which references the Battle of Trafalgar and Waterloo, both important battles within French history, all put into one singular character with a secret family name in water, which we still don't know about yet. There's countless more connections, and there's going to be many more videos that will be created because of this one. French Piece is definitely one of those videos. So I want to address a few things before I end this video, and just before that, I want to thank you for getting through this. Send this to anyone who is upset about Zoro's backstory. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing because like the rest of the videos on my channel, everything connects. So don't miss the next connections that I make. And so a question that gets asked a lot, and I have many answers for, is how I think black blades are made. Somewhere in the next few videos, I will make a concerted video for this, but I mentioned one of the possible ways that we could answer this. So if you cycle all the way back to the Shusui conversation, one of the options was that the personification was the image that was in mind when forging it. Essentially a way to commemorate somebody and their image would stay permanently within that blade. The interesting thing about that is Ryuma was said to have forged his blade black throughout his battles. There's two ways to think about it. It could be that on the path towards becoming the greatest swordsman in the world, he imagined his goal as the man behind Shusui. So when it was forged black, it became that person. The other way to think about it is Shusui could be the reason why Ryuma decided to become Sword God. In other words, his motivation or his source of will. Which is incredibly interesting because that gives two very interesting possibilities when it comes to the other Black Blade with Mihawk. Because with the previous context, either the Yoru's personification was his end goal or his motivation, which could serve as a beautiful parallel to Zoro because he may be able to turn the Wado Ichimonji black, and when he does, it might be reforged with Kuina's image in mind, as she was the reason for Zoro to pursue this dream, making both Zoro and Mihawk motivated motivated from similar things. And if both lines of logics pans out and he can turn a blade black from his goal, then Mihawk could become the personification of one of his swords. And if there was one that I would choose, it would be the Enma, as it already has so many ties to dragons and Dracula refers to dragons. Maybe the dragon Zoro slays is Mihawk, like I said before. Anyways, to address one last thing, I know what I painted out for Zoro is that he would be a nepo baby of some sorts, a child blessed with heritage, if he is the descendant of not just sword god Ryuma, but also the image of the Shusui, or at the minimum prominent French swordsman. That would make it almost as if lineage carried him. Then you add Minks to that possible mix, and it makes it out that Zoro's monstrous chase that we have come to love was essentially gifted to him. But let me just point out how many people after Ryuma did not contest a reputation even close to the one that Zoro is reaching right now. If I am right on the paternal side of things, no one has created a reputation that would justify Zoro's achievements. Even on the Mink side, how many Minks are there, or hybrid human Minks, that never created worth for themselves? Zoro would be the first in many generations on both sides paving his own paths. And to circle back to where we started, a person isn't measured by where they started or even by where they ended. It's by how far they walked on their path, which is why we aspire to follow in the footsteps of legends. What's ironic about that is that legends never follow, but instead create a new path and cover a distance that is unimaginable and feels unreachable to most others. Even if most of us were to run, regardless of where we started, we wouldn't be able to reach these levels, and it makes you wonder why. What makes us different? It's natural for us to want to question what advantages does this person have that others didn't have to explain why someone achieved more than another, which pushes us to acknowledge or dismiss someone's results based on their starting point, instead of recognizing the relative struggle each one of us goes through as we move through any walk of life. People like Luffy and Zoro aspire to be great, not by judging the resume of their competitors, but rather by taking in every moment of time to make sure they walk the greatest distance they potentially can. They recognize that you cannot control your starting point and have seen how greatness is not gifted, it is earned. The world is not that easy of a place, and everyone is born into this strange and unfamiliar land. And with that, let me end this with a quote from Zoro when he first entered Zou. "We're in a strange, unfamiliar land. Don't turn back. Always concentrate on what's ahead of you." And let me add that it's easy to get lost in the past, so focus on the future, so that you can create a world that will remember you in history, and that way the past will never lose you. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.